Welcome to Communism and the World, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation series dedicated to telling the true story of communist ideology, its history of political implementation, and the legacy of Marxist political economy. I'm Dr. Murray Bissett, Director of Academic Programs, and I am pleased to present to you today Dr. A. James McAdams, the William M. Scholl Professor of International Affairs, Professor of History, and Director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Jim is also the author of Vanguard of the Revolution, the Global Idea of the Communist Party, which examines the political history of the party from the 1840s to the present. It's the first comprehensive history of the Communist Party and can be found on Amazon. During today's event, Karl Marx and His Legacy, Jim will explain some of the central tenets of Marxism as articulated in the Communist Manifesto, how these ideas were implemented historically, and the connection between Marxist theory and communist practice. We are truly privileged to have Jim here with us to share his profound knowledge of Marxism and the history of global communist parties. Following his presentation, we will have a discussion with Jim, drawing upon questions submitted by the audience. You can submit questions for him throughout the event using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And with that, Jim, I welcome you and invite you to share your presentation.
And welcome to the revolution. Now, by that, I don't mean a revolution today, although if you think about it, we live in enormously troubled times, and who's to say what lies in the future? One thing that we know about history is that it does not proceed in a straight line. And as we move forward in this course, you're going to see this again and again and again. Now, what I mean by the revolution in this case is the context in which communism took off. And I mean in particular, the Industrial Revolution, a revolution in science, technology, production, social relations. All of these things combined together that took off in the first half of the 19th century. Now, why is this important? Because understanding the Industrial Revolution is the key to understanding the Communist Manifesto. There is no more important work in the history of communism than Karl Marx's manifesto. And in fact, if you think about its impact, the Communist Manifesto has had, or did have, a transformative experience on the world, on international affairs, and on countries across the globe. To understand its impact, all you need to think about is the fact that by the 20th century, communism emerged, Marx's dream in part, communism emerged as the primary challenger to liberal democracy as we understand it. The primary challenger, much more of a profound challenge than fascism, for example. When I say that, let's think about the fact that hundreds of millions of people, indeed billions, were exposed to communism, lived through it, are still living through it. And the common kernel that ties this whole experience together, that provides its roots, is the Communist Manifesto, a work written in 1848 by a guy who himself tried to be an activist, but was never really a true revolutionary, an intellectual, a profoundly influential person of his time, but who somehow, in a very brief statement, managed to capture a group of ideas, a collection of ideas that would motivate people across the world. And understanding that is so essential for understanding what it means to talk about the appeal of the communist idea. Now, let me underscore this point. So it will help you think about the lectures that you will see as we'll proceed in this course. One thing that we know we're all familiar with, that you'll see again and again, will be the atrocities, the inhumanity, the violence, the incredibly powerful states that existed under communist rule. That's indisputable. We all recognize that. We know about that. You're going to see multiple manifestations of that in your lectures about Lenin, about Stalin, Mao Zedong, and others. So that's extremely important. That's one story. The story I want us to think about today, however, is the story of why a work like the Communist Manifesto, and you've seen it, it's just a brief little pamphlet, why this work and Marx's ideas would be so compelling and so appealing that they would attract the interest, support, sacrifice of Communist Party members for years thereafter. 150 years. That's not a small and insignificant period of time. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to present you with a way of understanding the appeal of the Communist Manifesto. Now, of course, this is a broad brush statement. I can't cover absolutely everything. But I am going to emphasize that the issue here is appeal. Because if the manifesto didn't appeal to people, then nobody would have read it. Nobody would have followed through on it, right? Who cares? It's just another publication by an intellectual working in the British Library in the 1840s and thereafter in London. But the fact is that people cared and they were willing to make sacrifices for it. And let me add this, and sacrifice other people to bring its ideas to their realization. Now, here's my main point about its appeal. It is crucial to read the Communist Manifesto, not simply as the description of the views of a particular intellectual, philosopher, activist. It's important to read it as an engaging, inspirational, powerful call to action. That's what it is. It's not an academic treatise. It's a call to action. And we can see this in familiar words that you already know undoubtedly in the first and then the last few sentences of the manifesto. What does Karl Marx write? In his first sentence, Marx writes, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. A specter is haunting Europe." What a great image. There's a lot of times I wish I could write with that vivid imagery. Well, that captured the attention of a lot of people. So a specter is haunting Europe, communism, and then at the very end, Marx provides us, he provides his readers with a moral proclamation. I'm looking down here right at the manuscript. Marx says, "Let the ruling classes tremble at communistic revolutions. Let them tremble. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains." By implication, Marx is saying, who wants to be chained? The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. Instead, this is the good news, they have a world to win. They have a world to win. And that idea is repeated again and again by communist leaders for 150 years. It is powerful. Now, so the question is, okay, this is a call to action, but fine. Lots of people make a call to action. The question is, why was it appealing? Why did little group of people Marx associated with, 10, 20, 30 people, little group of people. Why was an audience suddenly captivated that would lead millions of people to become members of communist parties in about any country you can think of? Why was this in the manifesto? So very quickly, I'm going to give you 3 ideas that I get from reading this manuscript. The first is exaltation. This work is all about exalting the achievements of the Industrial Revolution and of the class, the revolutionary class, the industrial bourgeoisie, that made this transformation possible, that turned Britain, for example, turned England into the most powerful country in the world. So if you read it, and here I want to emphasize something, Marx is usually associated with the idea of hating the bourgeoisie. Well, that's only partly true, and I'll get to that. But Marx admired the bourgeoisie. And all you need to do is to see what he says in the manifesto. Marx says, the bourgeoisie has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. The bourgeoisie has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. After a while, then he says, the bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together, all of them. Subjugation of nature's forces, machinery, steam navigation, railways, cultivation, whole populations conjured out of the ground. Again, Marx's imagery is great. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? So he admires the bourgeoisie. Fundamentally important to recognize. They are a revolutionary class. They made, in one sense, the Industrial Revolution possible. Their ideas, also their power. At the same time, so we have exaltation. At the same time, of course, the Communist Manifesto is a scathing attack on the bourgeoisie, what it has done to the lower classes, and a call for justice. Then what Marx argues is, the problem is that the bourgeoisie made all of its progress, all of its successes, all of its pursuit of profit, made everything possible on the backs of the working class, or proletariat, as he calls it. And throughout the manifesto, you'll see vivid descriptions of what happened to this class. Marx says, as privates of an industrial army, they're placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class, the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the bourgeois manufacturer. And in fact, Marx takes this even a step further, and he says about the working class, he says, proletariat, he says, they are turned into things. German is a marvelous language for expressing this. Verdinglichung. They are turned into things by the productive processes, by the bourgeoisie. Now, Marx adds, it used to be the case, he says, that there were various survival mechanisms for the people who were enslaved by the ruling classes. There was even a prospect that these people could kind of look into the clouds and imagine that they would transcend their class identity, those who were oppressed. But what Marx declares is that the modern laborer, the proletariat, instead of rising with the process of history, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops, Marx says, more rapidly than population and wealth. And then, of course, and this is the call for justice, Marx says, the bourgeoisie has made itself unfit to be the ruling class in society. It has made it unfit to rule. And of course, this means its time is up and it's time for it to go. Now that's a value judgment. This then leads me to my third point. So we have exaltation, we have the oppression that the bourgeoisie is guilty of. And here as a third point, we have something very important, and that is to recognize that Marx makes what is a putatively scientific prediction. It's a claim to science. The early 19th century was actually the period in which what we understand as the social sciences were invented. This wasn't a concept until this point. Karl Marx, along with people like Thomas Malthus, people like Darwin, were people who thought deeply about applying what had been the language and methods of the natural sciences to society. And so Marx was one of the inventors of the social sciences. But more than that, what did he do? He combined his description of Britain's industrial revolution and then his call for justice into a bold prediction that a similarly powerful revolution against the prevailing capitalist system not only could take place, not only could come, and not only should come, but that it inevitably would come. If you want to understand the appeal of the Communist Party for all of these years, it's that prediction that is absolutely crucial. It's not only that a revolution could come, it's not only that it should come, but that it was inevitable that it would come. And what he argued was it would come as the result, a paradoxical consequence, if you will, of the conditions that the bourgeoisie had created in its own factories, the conditions for its own wealth. Because what Marx argued was that by bringing the proletariat together, by bringing workers together in factories, it put them in a position where they could realize their power and recognize that there was no alternative to overthrowing the system around them. So remember, this is a prediction. Marx calls it science. Wissenschaft is the German term here. So this is what he says. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers with the possibility of associating together. Revolutionary association, he calls it. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces. What the bourgeoisie, therefore, produces, this is the irony, above all, are its own gravediggers. Again, marvelous imagery if you're trying to start a revolutionary movement. The bourgeoisie produces not just steam engines, not just new technology, but the bourgeoisie produces its own gravediggers. And therefore, Marx concludes, its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. This will happen, he proclaims. You can count on it. Now, those are the foundations, and you could see why they would be appealing to some people, at least at this time, particularly educated people, particularly young people, particularly people in the upper classes. After all, you had to have money at this time if you wanted to spend the time making revolution, or at least dreaming of it. Time is a precious commodity, just so today, for everybody in the world. Most people don't have the time to think about revolution, but Marx did, in part because he had a financier named Friedrich Engels who was able to supply him with the money that he needed, his family, and he needed to survive. So that's the appeal. But I will now quickly point to some decisive ambiguities within the Communist Manifesto that are essential to recognize in order to understand why Marx's idea of a communist revolution progressed as it did, and again and again and again took forms that he never anticipated. So that the thing about the Communist Manifesto is to read it and see why it might be exciting, but then also to see how his points might be so ambiguous that they could lead to different, unanticipated, and in many cases, unwelcome consequences down the road. So, and this is what they were. One ambiguity, one great uncertainty was, what would this revolution look like after all? All revolutions, all of them, involve violence. That makes sense. After all, a revolution is about totally overthrowing an existing form of production, existing social organizations. And as you'll see when you get to China in this course, also modes of consciousness. So necessarily involves violence. But here's an interesting thing about the manifesto. Marx is very coy about this subject. You can find them, but you have to look closely to recognize the points at which he suggests revolution will not be a dinner party, as Mao Zedong would later say. It would not be a dinner party. But again, remember, Marx is trying to convince people to join. So there's less of the gory stuff up front, although it's all applied by what he said. Secondly, when would this revolution take place? Would it take place tomorrow, or in a year, or 10 years? Marx wants to say that the revolution is imminent. But what does that mean? If you're a revolutionary, you're impatient and you want the revolution now. So what does that mean concretely? These were impatient people. He was impatient, but for those who are going to go out into the streets and revolt and try to mobilize the proletariat, he couldn't compete. They wanted action right now. So when would this be? And then finally, the key question, and one that runs throughout the whole history of communism, is what if the revolution, as Marx envisioned it, did not take place? What if it did not happen? What if the proletariat went into the factories and continued to labor, suffered, but then organized trade unions, some forms of collective organization? People came, they raised their wages, and so forth. What if that happened? In fact, that happened in England. But the big issue here is anywhere. What if the revolution didn't take place? What if the proletariat didn't take its assigned place in history. What was a revolutionary to do? What were they to think? How were they to act? Now here, and this is the reason I wrote my book on the Communist Party, Vanguard of the Revolution. Here, Marx has a tantalizing answer. And again, you have to look for it. His tantalizing answer in the manifesto is that if the proletariat did not revolt, that other people would do it for them and lead them. That, as he says, certain sections of the ruling class, little segments. In other words, people like him would break off from their class and provide the inspiration that was necessary to make the proletariat do what it was historically ordained to do. And here, of course, we get to the question about why Marx and the Communist Manifesto were followed with such global catastrophes in the 20th century. Why, probably in Marx's ideas, things went awry. And the question is simply this: if you give self-designated revolutionaries like him or his friends or future generations the opportunity to lead others, how do you know that they will act in the true spirit of the revolution? How do you know that they'll be noble? How do you know that the sacrifices that they make will be pure and not self-interested and not selfish? You just don't know. And as you move along in this course, you'll see how this question, which is hinted at in the Communist Manifesto, arises again and again and again.
Thank you, Jim, for an incredibly rich and thought-provoking presentation. Before we turn to some of the questions attendees have already sent in, I want to remind those in attendance that you can submit your questions for Jim via the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Now, I know that we have many educators among our attendees. What advice do you have for them in teaching the Communist Manifesto? Are there any approaches that you have found to be particularly effective in getting young people to understand the ideas and their consequences?
Well, I'll tell you, here's my key to teaching, as I try to be an effective teacher. The key for me is, how do you get a young person to care? Why should they care about something that was written in 1848 and that was the language of which is kind of awkward and unusual for them? Why shouldn't they care more about, the latest Facebook post? And the way that I do it is to ask them two questions. One, what is a revolution? Is it simply political? Is it economic? What does it mean if you say, a revolution in technology? So what is that exactly? And then I ask, and what would it be like for you to live through a revolution? If we take simply the revolution in technology, man, has that had a transformative impact on all of our lives. So much so that younger people are absolutely immersed in it. And by posing the question this way, by making it intelligible and interesting to curious young people, what I found is then they go for it. Then they start talking about it. Then they start wondering about, well, where would I have stood in 1848? What if I, as a upper middle class American, well, of course, English at that time, but as a privileged individual, what would I have thought in 1848 in reading the Communist Manifesto? Would I perhaps have found parts of it appealing? And of course, our students provide different answers to this question.
Wonderful. Thank you. So knowing the audience of a text can really help a reader to understand its meaning and significance. Now, in your book, you mentioned that the audience of the Communist Manifesto was not actually the working class. And you touched upon this in your presentation by mentioning that one had to have enough time in order to ponder the revolution and think about these things. So despite the exhortation, for the workers of the world to unite that it concludes with, the audience, as you indicated, is the educated revolutionary class, people like Marx and Engels. Do you see this as an indication of an implicit Leninism right in the very DNA of Marxism? And is there any other evidence, if so?
Well, yeah, if we mean by Leninism simply revolutionary elitism, yes, absolutely. And again, let's return to our hypothetical young revolutionary in 1848, or when Lenin wrote What Is to Be Done, his very elitist tract in 1902. What would that have been like? What would these people have been like? These people were invariably young and educated and privileged. After all, if you weren't educated and privileged, first of all, in 19th century England, you probably wouldn't have been able to read. So the manifesto wouldn't have done you much good. But secondly, as I suggested, you wouldn't have had the time or the inclination to think about how a revolution might transform your life. I mean, you were focusing on how to get food home to keep your family alive. Now, here's what's important about understanding the situation, and it gives us a really vital clue into the psychological makeup of revolutionaries. If I say to somebody, you can belong to my elite group, and we're the masters of science. We really understand the science of human nature, of human behavior. And we have insight into what should happen and then will happen. That's tremendously appealing. It also means, though, that you get a lot of hubris out of the experience. You start to think, well, after all, I am special because I have all of this insight. And I guess since I'm charged to make the revolution, I should feel good about myself. After all, I know what the proletariat doesn't know. But you can see there's a problem, because the more and more you think like that, the more you see yourself as above those people whose conditions you're trying to improve. And so there is, even at this stage in 1848, there's a kind of built-in condescension in the elite focus, elitist aspects of Marxism and the people to follow him. And that kind of consent, that kind of condescension then leads down the road to people saying, not just, if you don't do what I want, I'll be disappointed, or please listen to me, but saying, if you don't do what I want, because I'm right, then that's it for you. So even at this point, we can see the challenge, of dealing with the psychology that is created among these young elite idealists.
Yeah, so often I've come across, this common counter argument. So this is the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. We're concerned with telling the true history of the horrors of communist implementation over more than a century now, and that are continuing, even today. And so some on the left will say, well, that's not true communism, or that wasn't true socialism, and really the problem was Stalin. Economists often refer to this as the horse and jockey problem. The jockey's been the problem, not the horse. The horse of communism is still okay. Another way that this is often expressed is that, communism in theory is wonderful, but in practice it has been terrible, and we need to move it towards what it could be in theory. Do you find these arguments the least bit persuasive? Why or why not?
Well, I mean, this is a subject of continual debate among scholars, among politicians. I think it partly comes back to whom do we attribute the consequences of ideas? How much should we blame on Marx? Now, if later on you're talking about could Leninism be realized and was it a good thing, and should Western countries have adopted Leninism, then I think the answer is pretty clear. No, nobody would have wanted that. In Marx's case, it's important to recognize that he was part of a generation of people who were thinking about, well, how do we reorganize society? So there were people that were enthusiastic about Marx, but broke ranks with him, and who formed moderate trade unions, eventually moderate parties, like the Social Democratic Party of Germany, that weren't revolutionary. So I think it would be a mistake to just say, well, all of this began with Marx, and therefore the way communism developed was inevitable. I just don't think that would be, from the standpoint of an historian, a very useful claim. The other issue, of course, that's important to recognize is it didn't get a uniform communism. So even if it's the case that it was coming, Leninism and its various formations, those formations were different. And this is something I've covered in my own work and in my book and elsewhere. And I think it's equally important to focus on the differences among these countries. I wouldn't want to be ruled by any of their leaders, but just the same, so that we understand why communism could be appealing in so many different places. And Russia, China, Cuba, Germany, those are very different places with very different histories. Well, if we want to understand that, then we need to have a subtle approach to understanding and a nuanced approach to understanding communism. But again, I'll say, in my travels in the communist world and the post-communist world, certainly I've never encountered one of these regimes that I would want to lead me and dictate my life. Not at all.
Thank you. You've mentioned a few times that Marx is one of the founders of social science, and that he sought to pair his what we would characterize today as a qualitative descriptive analysis of British capitalism with the normative theory of justice. Are there any indications that Marx had any appreciation for what would later become a quantitative revolution in economic theory, and of really trying to use hard economic data to understand economics, and how would that have influenced his thought? If
well, I mean, Marx, like Adam Smith and others, were trying to develop that data. They were trying to look for ways of understanding the rise of capitalism. So in a long and increasingly intensely boring, but still historically important work called Das Kapital about capitalism, he developed a methodology that he thought would work. And however, I don't think it bears much of a resemblance to modern economic theory.
Thank you. Can you succinctly summarize Marx's understanding of the relationship between capitalism and communism? Because as you presented it in your presentation, it's not just simply conflictual.
Right. Well, what Marx foresaw was that there would be successive stages that would develop after the fall of capitalism. I think sometimes people have this image of, Marx thinking that, well, communism would be a period of, a time in which human beings would be totally liberated and they'd have lots of leisure time to do what they want and not be burdened by work. But what Marx assumed, although again I would say he wasn't always as specific as one would want, is that he assumed that there would be a revolution against the capitalist system. But he didn't think that that would automatically lead to communism. In fact, the way that he and his followers, his political followers, later saw it, there would be two stages of a revolution. Sometimes they refer to them as the first stage of socialism and then the second stage. Well, in the first stage, for him, and then even more clearly through his followers, the first stage was all about violence, because if you wanted to overthrow the system, that meant that you had to go take people's property away. Marx says something to the effect of, in the beginning of the revolution, there would have to be certain despotic inroads made on private property. Well, if you say despotic inroads, then I'm assuming what you mean is lots of violence, where you go out to kill those who own property, and then they fight back and try to kill you. So that's the confrontation. Marx assumed, however, and here he is not specific, and communists wrestled with it for the entire period in which we can speak about communism. Marx assumed, though, that there would be a point at which this first revolution, the revolution of the state, the revolution of violence, the revolution of force, would gradually wither away, gradually decline, and it would be less and less necessary for leaders to use force to get people to do what, in their view, was the right thing. It would be less necessary to use force. Now, and then that would enter a period in which people would all be rewarded for their work, their interests would be taken care of, and they would share property in common, at least kind of in a principled sense. Now, it's a nice idea, and it motivated lots and lots of people. There's no doubt about that. And we can see that from one country to the next. It's a fantastically good idea. But this issue of force stuck with communist regimes, communist parties, for the entirety of their history. And there are not that many communist countries in the world today. But when you look at China, for example, you have no problem finding tremendous reliance on force to a scary extent. So, but after Marx, but particularly after the Russian Revolution, people just struggle with this. And so you have some communists saying, well, maybe we can move away from the use of force and violence sooner, and others saying, absolutely not. And so as you move on in this course, as we think about the development of communism over time, you'll see how that issue comes up again and again and again.
So in thinking about that, you know, how I've usually thought about it is that, you know, Marx has this conception of human nature, and it's very plastic. That is, it's not terribly determined, but it can be and is determined by the economic superstructure, right? So the reason why we're self-interested and greedy is because of capitalism. Once you establish, you know, a new economic system, human nature itself will change. This is often referred to as, you know, the creation of the new Soviet man or the new communist man. You know, is human nature the main thing that Marx got wrong? Is that the problem? And, you know, that which makes the entire Marxist edifice, you know, necessarily violent because it has to impose itself constantly?
Well, I don't, you know, I think it is about human nature. It's about an interpretation of human nature. Um, you know, humans can be good and beneficent, or they can be selfish and cruel. I think that Marx's hope, or what he anticipated, to the extent that he spelled it out, was that when you abolish the capitalist system and you put hands in, ultimately, if you put economic power, political power, and ultimately everybody's hands, when you liberated them, then they would be free to become their selves, their best selves. In effect, Marx was, like other people in his time, saying, you know, man has all these good qualities, and for the following reasons, this could be applied to Darwin or others, for the following reasons, he or she hasn't been able to realize what's good. So that was Marx's expectation. But then what happened later was that people like Stalin said, well, that all sounds fine and good, but we're liberating people a little bit, and they're automatically going to war with each other, or they're automatically violating their true interests. So human nature, yes, and with the qualifications I've made, but I will say this. One of the great things about living in a liberal democracy is that we live in a society under a polity in which the worst aspects of human nature are constrained, tamped down. We have viable courts, we have viable party system, and limited executive. The great problem, coming back to human nature and to the worst aspects of it, is that if you create states that have total power, and in fact, case after case, invest total power in the hands of a Lenin or a Stalin or a Mao, total power, a Pol Pot, Enver Hoxha, you name it, then those people are in the position to do the worst things possible to their fellow human beings.
Now, you've mentioned that understanding the Industrial Revolution is a key to understanding communism. How do you think that Marx would account for the fourth Industrial Revolution? And by that, I mean the digital revolution and the rise of the knowledge worker, especially given the fact that knowledge workers are the possessors of the most important and most valuable kind of capital, which is knowledge and the skills, the technical skills.
Well, I mean, you know, literally, it would have been very hard to anticipate that in the 1840s. On the other hand, there are, you know, two elements there that we shouldn't lose track of, or maybe three elements. The first is just the fact that Marx really did some deep thinking about what a revolution would look like, and so there is a lot, or why it would take place. So there's a lot there that one could glean in thinking about, you know, our fourth knowledge revolution. The second is Marx was a global thinker, and I always laugh when people talk about globalization because, well, okay, you know, we have globalization now, but in 1848, Marx was all about globalization. After all, he was thinking about an international revolution, an uprising of the proletariat, wherever you could find the proletariat. So it was very global. And so in that way, he certainly would have, appreciated what we now see in the knowledge revolution. I would say, though, the third thing that is worth keeping in mind, and it's so important for understanding the future of liberal democracy, the people who have control, in this case, not over the means of production, but the people in our country and in the West who have control everywhere of information, of the flow of information, have tremendous power. And sometimes when we think about politics, we like to think of it only in terms of, formal governments in Washington, Seoul, or Berlin. But what we are seeing more and more as part of this fourth revolution is the centralization of power, control of information in the great centers of technology. We see this in Facebook, we see it in Google. And, maybe we need to be thinking more and more about that, about those people who are in the position to shape our own ideas. They have a lot of power. And I think Marx would have appreciated that.
Thank you. So why did Marx basically invent the word capitalism to describe, a market-based economic system? And why is it that he credits the bourgeoisie with creating everything that seems to come out of, a classical liberal understanding of the interaction of science, knowledge, philosophy, economics, and politics?
Well, to a certain extent, it's a shorthand because he has different ways of understanding bourgeoisie. But again, he was part of a milieu that it was excited about these people. We can't today even begin to understand. Maybe we will in retrospect when we think about our own fourth revolution. But we today can't even begin to understand the profound effect of these developments upon intellectuals in the Industrial Revolution. The absolutely profound effect. And it wasn't, simply on people like Karl Marx, but it was upon other intellectuals, also upon the wealthy, states, and the entrepreneurs themselves. At this time, people could look at what they were doing as if they were somehow substituting themselves for God, that they have become the new creators. And let's also keep in mind here, this isn't just about economics. This isn't just about a revolutionary change in the production process. The Industrial Revolution meant power. It meant power for states and peoples. So that England didn't just become wealthier. England was put into the position where it could control the world. Where when you looked at England, and this again, you see it in the Communist Manifesto in these parts that I think are dramatic, brilliant, and accurate. But when you see how England was transformed in such a short period of time into a global power that could dictate the policies, the outcomes, the interests of so much of the world, you can understand why that would be appealing, not just to Marxists, but to everybody who was in a position to get on that train and to be part of this. Now, of course, by the time at the end of the century, 19th century, and into the turn of the 20th century, a lot more states have jumped onto that train, particularly Germany, with major consequences. The United States, and they were all rivals for this these revolutionary developments that had begun, let's say, in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So for me, that's what's important. Marx would say, well, it's about economics. I say, no, it's about power.
Thank you. So it's common today for the left to draw a distinction between private property on the one hand, by which they mean the means of production, and personal property on the other hand, by which they tend to mean blue jeans, rock and roll albums, and various other consumable and personal effects. Is this a distinction that you see drawn in Marx, or is this post hoc? And is there a principle upon which to support that distinction?
Well, I wouldn't want to read things back into Marx's context. I will say this. I mean, I'm not particularly concerned about left and right and things like this. This image of people wearing blue jeans and from my youth of the late 60s is one thing. But on the other hand, the debate in Western society since Marx's time, before Marx's time, has been about how much control the state should exercise over the economy. That's the debate. And so Marxists, socialists would say a significant amount. And conservatives, old-fashioned Republicans would take the opposite position. But there hasn't been a time at which you simply have a laissez-faire economy and the state plays no role in the maintenance of that economy. I mean, it's just not historically true. So again, that's why I would put my response under a larger umbrella, and I would say, not left or right, not Marx or anti-Marx, but to what extent does the state get to control the means of production, as Marx would put it? To what extent does the state get to control the economy? And in fact, that is a continual debate in the West. That's been an essential part of capitalism.
Thank you. As a final question, if you were teaching the Communist Manifesto to high school students, what are the 3 points you would try to emphasize and have them understand?
I try to have them understand, first of all, the context. As I emphasize the Industrial Revolution, I'd have them think about what it would have been like at that time to try to make a revolution. And then finally, I'd ask them to look into their own lives, their own selves, and ask themselves, are there any possible circumstances under which they could become revolutionaries? And why not? Because throughout history, this is the kind of question young people have asked themselves. Times are changing. Who knows what their answers will be?
Thank you, Jim, not only for joining us, but also for your efforts to help us better understand the theory and practice of Marxism and the history of communist implementation. And thank you all for attending. If you would like a copy of Jim's book, you can find it on Amazon. The title is Vanguard of the Revolution, the Global Idea of the Communist Party. You can also find more information about Jim's other works on his faculty page at the University of Notre Dame. Please join us for our next event in the Communism and the World series, which will take place 2 weeks from now on Wednesday, May 20th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The subject will be Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution, during which we will hear from Dr. Sean McMeekin, a member of VOC's Academic Council, the Francis Fulnery Professor of European History and Culture at Bard College, and author of The Russian Revolution. You can find more information about upcoming events, our curricular resources, and other professional development opportunities for teachers at victimsofcommunism.org. You can also follow our work on Facebook and Twitter at VO Communism. For the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I'm Murray Bissett. Thank you again. Have a great day and remain healthy.